Well, I will get started here this morning. Be mindful of everybody's time. Jeff Scala with the Florida Association of Counties, filling in for Mr. Eric Poole, who's our executive director at the Institute for County Government, for another federal policy update with NACo staff. Of course, we're joined by Eryn Hurley, who's going to provide some several federal updates. I know we probably have some questions about where we are in the budget process. But she's going to give a really big update on ARPA, on the American Rescue Plan, some of the Corn and Padilla amendments that have been made. There was a webinar earlier this week. In case you missed that, she's going to provide some updates. So I'll hand it over to Eryn. I know we'll have a few more issues to talk about here this morning. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. And good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's having a great week. So again, Eryn Hurley, Director of Government Affairs here at NACo. So today, just wanted to provide you all with a quick update, as Jeff mentioned, where we are in terms of a budget deal or appropriations for fiscal year 2024, some mental health legislation, and then the bulk of the presentation is going to be focusing on new guidance that was released by the Department of Treasury for that Corn and Padilla amendment. So first, in terms of appropriations, where we are. The House and Senate over the last month or so, month and a half, have been releasing their versions of various appropriations bills for fiscal year 2024. So there have been a couple of key differences here, specifically after there was that debt ceiling deal where there were certain funding levels that were authorized as part of that deal. Now what's happening on like the House side is that as the different House committees are passing their versions of these budget deals, those funding levels are actually lower. Meanwhile, in the Senate, they are sticking to those funding levels that were established by the debt ceiling deal. So obviously there are significant differences there that are going to have to be worked out. Of course, we've heard that because of those significant differences and just given the political climate, it's looking more like we're going to have a short-term funding resolution there. So what that means is we're just going to continue to maintain current funding levels, and something like that will be passed by the expiration deadline of September 30th of course this year. So we're looking like that will get punted. We're hoping that we'll be able to avert a government shutdown. That is kind of still up in the air as well, though, I will say. But definitely, I think at this point, we can kind of be pretty positive that no larger funding deal is long-term funding deal is going to be agreed upon by September 30th. So thinking that probably sometime in December, that Congress will be able to kind of come to a consensus on a long-term funding deal for fiscal year 2024. As part of that effort, though, I will say, with that September 30th deadline, there is another piece of legislation that NACo is looking to be reauthorized. So that's called the Support Act. And this is where that mental health piece comes in that I mentioned earlier. So what's happening with the Support Act? It's a health package, kind of like a more general health package. But why NACo is so interested in the reauthorization of this specific legislation is because we're looking to attach two specific bills that would address the Medicaid inmate exclusion policy, which of course is the policy, very harmful policy that makes it so when individuals are booked into jail, they're not convicted of a felony, they're pre-trial detainees, they actually lose their federal health benefits during this kind of limbo period, if you will say. Of course, as you all know, the county's on the hook for paying for those benefits. And so the two bills that I mentioned are the Reentry Act. They're both bipartisan, by the way, the Reentry Act and the Due Process Continuity of Care Act. Both those bills have been introduced in the House and Senate, have considerable bipartisan support. So what NACo is looking to do, and is what we're asking counties to do, is to reach out to their members of Congress, urge them to sign on as co-sponsors, and also urge their inclusion into that larger Support Act reauthorization bill, so that we're able to get those over the finish line and ultimately achieve, NACo and county's goal of finally addressing the harmful Medicaid inmate exclusion policy. Jeff also just posted into the chat our MIP toolkit, which provides you with a template letter that you can send to your member of Congress, a sample op-ed that you can also do, and also really helpful talking points as well. So that is a huge priority that we're looking to try to address by September 30th. And then now I want to move on to the bulk of this federal policy update. This is, apologies about the date, this is when I gave an update 2 days ago that Jeff mentioned we had a national membership call, but I wanted to provide you all with an overview of the new interim final rule that Treasury released for the Cornyn-Padilla amendment, which is all around additional flexibility when your county is investing those ARPA state and local fiscal recovery funds, which of course is that $65.1 billion pot of money that was authorized back in March of 2021. So first, just wanted to make sure that folks were aware that the interim final rule was actually released. You can scan that QR code on this slide here, where it'll take you directly to Treasury's landing page, and you'll have access to the overview of the interim final rule, which is about 20 pages, and then the full text of the interim final rule, which is 204 pages. So we have that there. This is just the picture of the Treasury website that you will be taken to as well. Also on that screen, sorry, I mixed those two up, but on this QR code will take you to NACo's analysis of that new interim final rule, which we distilled down all of the information from the 204-page rule, obviously with a county emphasis. This QR code is to Treasury's landing page that you can go ahead and scan for their resources. Now I just want to provide you with, before we kind of get into the weeds, an overview of Treasury's interim final rule. So you all are very familiar with the 2022 rule that Treasury came out with. That was for the original guidance of the American Rescue Plan State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. So there were originally 4 eligible use categories. It was public sector revenue, so that was to replace any lost revenue that you had because of the pandemic. You could use the ARPA dollars for public health and economic response, provide premium pay to essential workers, and then also invest in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. So now what this new interim final rule does is provide guidance on 3 new eligible use categories that you can use the funding for. So it's for emergency relief from natural disasters, surface transportation infrastructure, and then Title I projects. And Title I projects are really just projects that are eligible under the Community Development Block Grant Program, or CDBG. So these are some of the top highlights that I wanted to mention. So first and foremost, the final rule, or excuse me, the interim final rule actually isn't yet published in the Federal Register. So we're not actually sure when it's like fully going to be in effect. I will say Treasury said that they would publish it this week. So it should definitely be published this week, if not later today. It'll be published tomorrow. But that's all to say, you know, the actual interim final rule is out and you are able to read it. Another huge point, and this kind of goes back to this slide here about like the 4 original eligible use categories, is that this interim final rule is just, think of it as like a supplemental to the 2022 final rule that Treasury came out. That being said, this interim final rule does not alter any existing eligible uses for the state and local fiscal recovery fund that were outlined in that 2022 final rule. So those 4 categories, the original 4 categories, nothing changes at all. This also includes how you're using lost revenue and so on. So continue using the funds as you would. For the new 3 eligible use categories, natural disasters, transportation, and CDBG projects, you can use the funds for any costs that incurred beginning December 29th of 2022. So this is retroactive. So any costs around, you know, within those 3 categories that you incurred December 29th and thereafter, you can use the ARPA state and local fiscal recovery funds for that. Another key highlight is around, or 2 key highlights I will say, is around the obligation deadline and the expenditure deadline. So you all remember that the ARPA deadline in terms of obligation or obligating your ARPA funds is December 31st of 2024. that stays the same under this interim final rule. Nothing changes regarding the obligation deadline. However, in terms of the expenditure deadline, there are some key differences there. So and it gets a little bit confusing, but we'll talk more about it. And definitely, feel free to unmute throughout this, as I'm presenting, or throw some questions in the chat as well. But the differences with the expenditure deadline is, first, if you plan on using your ARPA funds under the natural disaster eligible use category, you continue to expend your funds by the December 31st, 2026 deadline. So that doesn't change at all, since that was the same expenditure deadline under the 2022 final rule. So nothing changes there. However, if you plan to use your ARPA dollars for the new surface transportation projects and CDBG projects, your new expenditure deadline is September 30th, 2026. So you're actually 3 months earlier than the original 2022 deadline, expenditure deadline. So there is that just one key difference that, of course, I wanted to mention. And then finally, other key highlights is that now you can use these ARPA state and local fiscal recovery funds to satisfy additional non-federal match requirements. So under the 2022 final rule, of course, you could use the ARPA funds for certain non-federal match requirements, such as the Environmental Protection Agency's state revolving funds for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, as well as like FEMA public assistance. So now under the interim final rule for these new eligible use categories, you also can use the funds to satisfy non-federal match for certain surface transportation projects, as well as any sort of like eligible projects and activities under the CDBG program as well too. So additional flexibility around that, which is great. So now what I wanted to do is provide you all with an overview of each of the new eligible use categories. So first is natural disasters. So what Treasury did in order to make this a little bit more kind of explanatory, or try to make it as easy as possible, since obviously this is like a fairly broad category, is that they actually broke it up into a two-step process for any state and local fiscal recovery fund recipient, but I'm just going to obviously talk about counties throughout this presentation. So two-step process for everyone. So if your county decides that you want to use your ARPA dollars to address natural disasters, provide emergency relief, the first step is to identify a natural disaster that has occurred or is expected to occur imminently, or in like the near future, or just in the future more generally. So that's your first step, identify a natural disaster. The second step is to identify the emergency relief that responds to that natural disaster, or emergency relief that would respond to the physical or negative economic impacts of a natural disaster that will occur in the future. And no matter what, when we're talking about emergency relief, whether it's for natural disasters that occurred in the past, are literally about to occur, or ones that are going to occur in the future, emergency relief always has to be related and reasonably proportional to the impact that your county has identified or experienced. So going through step one, in terms of identifying a natural disaster. So Treasury does outline their definition of what a natural disaster is. I'm not going to go through each one. I'm going to, of course, share the slides with Jeff and the FAC team, so they can send these along to you all. But as you can see here, they list a number of natural disasters: hurricanes, tornadoes, fire, drought, etc. In addition to all of these outlined, they also say there's any other natural catastrophe that's attributable to natural causes. So even outside of these like specific natural disasters that they name, any other like event that is caused by a natural disaster that causes your community physical and economic harm would be defined as a natural disaster. But again, it has to be a natural cause, not man-made. And then in terms of step two, which is, as I mentioned, identifying emergency relief. So Treasury also provides definitions of what emergency relief is. So it's, as you can see, it's any assistance that saves lives, protects public property, public health, and public safety, And then also lessens or averts the threat of a catastrophe. So that's like for a future natural disaster. It also responds to physical or negative economic impacts, or again, potential physical and negative economic impacts of a future natural disaster. There also is kind of another layer in this section as well that Treasury outlines, and it's really two scenarios. And depending on what scenario you have, whether it's A or B, which I'll go over in a second, that really decides what your eligible uses are and what can be covered by ARPA. So the first is scenario A is a natural disaster that has occurred or is expected to occur imminently. So when you're thinking of emergency relief, this is that assistance that saves lives, protects public health, property, safety, individuals, etc. Excuse me. And then scenario B is natural disaster that is going to occur in the future, right? So then that's the assistance to lessen or avert threats of a catastrophe. So two scenarios that you have to think about. So now that's confusing. At least it was confusing to me when I was reading the rule. So we're going to kind of go through the process of like, okay, what does this really look like when the two scenarios are in play, and what are the eligible uses, right? So let's talk about the two-step process associated with the two scenarios. So say your county chooses scenario A. So as you can see here, scenario A is at the top of the screen. It's a natural disaster that has occurred or is expected to occur imminently. So that's your scenario, right? So you still go to that step one, you're under scenario A, you identify the natural disaster. So when you're identifying the natural disaster, you use Treasury's definition, that table that I had gone over earlier, hurricanes, floods, drought, fire, etc. So you would use that, and it was or is subject to a declaration or designation in the form of a Stafford Act, emergency declaration by your state, or a designation of an event of a natural disaster by your county's chief executive. So it would satisfy those, the definition and a declaration. So it can either be federal, state, or local declaration, which is of course very helpful. Then step two is identifying the emergency relief needed to address the disaster. So these eligible uses, there are way more eligible uses than what I list here. The slide was not big enough to list all of those. So I just wanted to give you all a snapshot of what we were looking at. So natural disaster has occurred, literally is about to occur. Here's what you can use the funds for: temporary emergency housing, food assistance, financial assistance, other immediate needs, debris removal, cash assistance, home repairs, emergency protective measures. Emergency protective measures has about, I think, maybe 20 other eligible uses that's outlined in the final rule as well. So these would all go together. These are all eligible uses. The Treasury even says in the interim final rule, it's a non-exhaustive list that they outline. So again, as long as you can demonstrate that these activities are needed to address a natural disaster, it'll likely be an eligible use. Now let's move on to scenario two and how that would play out. So scenario two, again, this is a natural disaster that is expected to occur in the future. So again, we're back at step one, identify a natural disaster. This is a little bit more tricky, and I will say that NACo is going to submit comments to the Treasury Department because there's just not necessarily enough data, and all the data isn't correct, honestly. But all that being said, what a county would be required to do is document evidence of historical patterns or predictions of natural disasters that would demonstrate the likelihood of a future occurrence of a natural disaster. So they name, you could use FEMA's National Risk Index, and then you use that information to support your argument like, hey, we know that it's hurricane season in Florida in October. We know that something is going to happen. Therefore, we should be able to use the funds for all of these activities prior to October. We understand, FEMA's information, again, outdated, not always the most reliable. So what we're going to try to, when we submit our comments to Treasury, we're obviously going to point that out and just say, there should be other ways in which you can satisfy that requirement. So that's all to say, though, in step 2, when you're identifying the emergency relief, and something that we were really happy about, we met with Treasury about, spoke with them about, is that the fact that mitigation activities should really be included in eligible uses. Like, you can't just have the activities after a disaster takes place. You really need to have these mitigation activities for these natural disasters that are going to happen in the future. We know they're going to happen. You all know best. There are more natural disasters that are occurring now than really, I won't say ever, but there's a huge increase. So these mitigation activities include, this is not limited to this, but structure elevation, mitigation reconstruction, structural retrofitting, and so on. I won't go through all of those, but really, really happy to see that mitigation activities were included. And then beyond these eligible uses in terms of mitigation, I also want to say that there are capital expenditures under this category under this scenario B and emergency relief that you can use the funds for. So for the mitigation activities, these can be standalone projects or projects that are incorporated into repair or reconstruction projects that reduce or eliminate, potential threats of future natural disasters. I will say, if you end up using the funds in this way for capital expenditures, scenario 2, or emergency relief, if you do choose to do a capital expenditure and it's above $1 million, then you do have to write a written justification for Treasury. And so there are 3 components of that written justification. There's a description of the emergency relief to be provided and like the potential impact that it would address. So, you would say this project would house an additional 100 residents. So you would have to kind of have like a pinpoint of like how many residents this would help, or, just as a random example. You would also need to explain why this capital expenditure is appropriate. So like why your county's current resources could not, produce the same outcome. And then finally, you would have to compare your capital expenditure with 2 other capital expenditure projects and explain why yours is superior. So that's the written justification part. I will say also on the right side, there's no pre-approval from Treasury for these disaster relief projects. It's really similar, honestly, to the 2022 final rule, though. So that's just something that, I know counties are a little bit nervous about, but it's really, just think of it how all of you kind of undertook projects without Treasury's approval for like since 2022. It's the exact same thing. I also did want to mention that these funds also, you have to also make sure that you're following other federal requirements, specifically under FEMA. So there are a lot of limitations around duplication of benefits. In some, what I'm just going to say is that, if the natural disaster that you're addressing falls under a Stafford Act declaration, then it's subject to the duplication prohibition on duplication of benefits. So what that means simply is that you can't provide assistance to a person, business, or other entity for disaster losses if they're receiving assistance from another federal program. So that's just what I want to say. If for some reason that individual business or other entity hasn't received assistance yet from another federal program, and you're saying, you say, okay, we'll provide assistance to this recipient or subrecipient, but then they end up getting benefits from another federal program down the line, they would have to repay the county for that assistance. So really just make sure that whatever entity that you're allocating funds to in terms of disaster relief assistance, they aren't receiving federal funding from another program. And then just timeline for use, I already went over this, but again, if you're using the funds for natural disaster relief, your obligation and expenditure deadlines are the exact same as they were prior under the 2022 final rule. Now, moving on to the surface transportation and Title I projects or CDBG projects. So both of these categories are subject to the same requirements, which I'm going to go through. So there is a limitation of your ARPA contribution towards surface transportation and CDBG projects. So what that means is that you cannot exceed the greater of 10 million or 30% of your county's total ARPA, state and local fiscal recovery fund allocation, and use that on surface transportation or CDBG projects. So say if your county receives $60 million, and so you could, 30% of 60 million is 18 million, right? So that's greater than 10 million. Great. You have 18 million to use for surface transportation and CDBG projects if that's what you want to do. You can't go above that 18 million, but you can split it into surface transportation and CDBG. So you could, for example, use 10 million for surface transportation projects, and then you have 8 million left, right? So you could use 8 million for CDBG projects. So you can split up the two, you just can't go beyond 18 million. Another limitation, excuse me, is around you're required to supplement fund, or you can only supplement funds, you can't supplant funds. So what does that mean? So say you already have a project, a transportation or a CDBG project that's going on. You've already allocated funds to it. You can use ARPA state and local fiscal recovery funds to help out with those like additional costs that maybe you were unaware of, or, you want to add on, another portion of, let's say, I don't know, like an affordable housing unit that you're doing. You can use those in addition to the funds. However, if your county has entered into a contract with the U.S. Department of Transportation, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and saying, okay, we are going to use these federal funds for these projects. If you enter that contract, you cannot de-obligate those funds and then use ARPA state and local fiscal recovery funds. So rule of thumb, if you're in a contract with another federal agency for a specific project, you have to stay in that contract. You just do not touch the ARPA state and local fiscal recovery funds for that project. If you're not in a contract, you can use the funds to help out with other costs for that project. So again, supplement, help out, not supplant, don't de-obligate. The third requirement is compliance with other existing laws. This is pretty similar to the 2022 final rule in terms of, counties were required to comply with other federal and state laws. So under this eligible use category, a lot of the projects are subject to the National Environmental Policy Act, that's NEPA, and then Title I, which is CDBG of the Housing and Development Act. And then finally, 4 is again the obligation and expenditure deadlines, same obligation deadline of December 31st of 2024, but your new expenditure deadline is September 30th of 2026. So taking a look at the surface transportation project section. So what Treasury did is that they broke this section up also into kind of 3 different buckets of what is how they are going to categorize different transportation projects, and then also requirements under those 3 different buckets. So pathway 1 are transportation projects where you're supplementing projects with ARPA dollars that are already receiving funding from the U.S. Department of Transportation. Pathway 2 is that you're using ARPA dollars for projects that are not receiving U.S. Department of Transportation dollars. And then pathway 3 is satisfying the non-federal match requirements for certain surface transportation projects. So again, 3 buckets there. So taking a look at pathway 1 projects. So this is pretty straightforward, I will say. So this is where what Treasury did is that they aligned eligible uses with that of 26 different programs that are already administered by the U.S. Department of Transportation. So what you can do in terms of eligible uses under this pathway 1 is expand existing US DOT projects, cover unexpected costs of those existing US DOT projects, and then fund projects that are not currently approved by US DOT. All of the projects under this pathway 1, you are going to be working directly with the US Department of Transportation to make sure that these projects are eligible. And then you will also be, of course, reporting to the Department of Treasury, but mostly you're going to be working with US Department of Transportation on these. So these are all of the eligible uses under pathway 1. A lot of these, I will say, are formula grant programs. So oftentimes the state is actually submitting proposals to the Department of Transportation for funding. So what NACo is going to do is make sure, okay, hey, a lot of these are state programs. What does that exactly mean for counties? But these are all the programs that are newly eligible and activities that you can use ARPA funds for. Pathway 2 projects. So again, breaking down into like a whole other level. What Treasury did is that they separated Pathway 2 projects, which are those projects that aren't receiving funding from U.S. Department of Transportation. They separated those into a streamlined framework and regular framework. Streamlined framework, I'm just going to say these are easier projects for a county to take on. These are projects that qualify under the RAISE program. That's a program under the Department of Transportation. If you do the streamlined framework or a project under the streamlined framework, you are not required to obtain Treasury approval prior to using these funds. You are not subject to NEPA, and that's simply because Treasury thinks that these projects are a lot more straightforward since they're already eligible under the RAISE program. They're less costly, more compliant. The regular framework, which they don't have a name for, Treasury doesn't have a name for it yet. The regular framework are those that are outside the streamlined framework. So Treasury thinks that those are more costly, they're higher risk. They are subject to NEPA. You are also required to submit a notice of intent to Treasury outlining pretty much everything that is going to, like the project is going to include, project description, the cost, timeline, if you have enough resources, etc. So it's a lot more of a timely process. So under the streamlined framework, here are some of the eligible projects. It's highway projects, bridge projects, public transportation projects. And on this QR code on the right side of the screen, what you can do is you can scan that, and that will take you to all of the other eligible RAISE program projects. So you can actually see all of the eligible uses there. So these are some of the requirements associated with the Pathway 1 projects that are under the streamlined framework. So again, you have to comply with all of those US DOT requirements, wage and labor requirements, procurement requirements. Again, not subject to NEPA. There is a limitation on certain operating expenses, which again is aligned with US Department of Transportation's requirements. And then again, under Pathway 2, these are projects outside of the streamlined framework. So projects are those that aren't eligible under the RAISE program. They're above $10 million when you're allocating funds to a surface transportation project. And then also any sort of activities that don't fall within the categorical exclusions outlined by the Department of Transportation. So as I mentioned, if your county does want to use the funds for a project outside of the streamlined framework, you have to submit that notice of intent. You submit it to that email that's on the screen here. And I will say Treasury is still working on exactly what a framework would look like for this, and you can submit comments in response to the interim final rule to help provide some input as they are trying to build out that framework. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. These are just the example of the information that is needed for the notice of intent. And then finally, Pathway 3. These are when you're using ARPA state and local fiscal recovery funds to satisfy local match requirements. So as you can see here, there are 4 key areas or 4 key programs that you can use the funds for the local match: infra grants, fixed guideway capital investment grants, mega grants, projects eligible for credit assistance under the TIFIA program as well too. So a lot of I'm not going to go through all of the various projects that you can use the funds for the non-federal match, but as you can see, there are a lot there too. And then finally, just as a quick reminder, for these requirements, you have to, for these project 3, Pathway 3 projects, you have to speak with the Department of Treasury when you're thinking about using the non-federal match to make sure that it's in compliance. And then you also will have to report to the U.S. Department of Transportation in terms of when you're using the non-federal match, and then also, of course, report to the Department of Treasury as well too. And then simply, again, reminder, expenditure deadline stays the same, obligation deadline stays the same for December 2024. And then expenditure deadline is September 30th, 2026. So 3 months earlier than originally. And then finally, the last section here is those Title I or CDBG projects. So pretty much what Treasury did is that they outlined all of the eligible activities under CDBG with this new interim final rule. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but as you can see, a very long list of eligible uses that strictly align with CDBG activities. Treasury also outlined some ineligible activities, and this is specifically under the CDBG program. So left side, these are ineligible uses. What I really want to stress here, though, is that just because they're ineligible under this very specific Title I CDBG projects category, they might be eligible in other eligible use categories under like the whole 2022 or 2022 final rule. So for example, like new housing construction, just because that's ineligible under CDBG, this specific eligible use category, new housing construction, you can still use your revenue loss for that. Or new housing construction would also be eligible under addressing negative economic impact under the 2022 final rule eligible use category. So I just want to make sure that that folks know that this doesn't mean that just because they're listed here that they're ineligible. And then some project requirements. It's simply, I won't go through all of these, but these are just simply a lot of the CDBG program requirements. So, you know, you have to meet certain percentage thresholds when you are allocating funds around low and moderate income housing, public service, planning and administrative cost caps, and so on. I will say NEPA does apply for these types of projects as well too, and Davis-Bacon Act labor standards also apply. And then there is some pre-approval requirements here as well too for these CDBG projects. Again, complying with NEPA, you have to have a certification. You have to send a certification to Treasury as well as receive approval from Treasury prior to using the funds for Title I projects. There are, excuse me, there are some exemptions for these projects, but for the most part, you definitely need to work with Treasury to receive that approval. And again, similar to the transportation projects, obligation deadline is the same. Expenditure deadline is that new September 30th of 2026. And then since this is an interim final rule, folks can submit comments to the Department of Treasury. Again, it hasn't been published in the Federal Register, but once it is, if you scan that QR code, you'll actually be taken to regulations.gov where you can actually submit comments there. And whenever it's submitted to the Federal Register, you'll have 90 days to submit comments, which then Treasury will read and produce a final rule there. I know that was a lot of information, and like I said, I will share the slides with Jeff and the FACT team so that you all will be able to have them. We do also have a recording of the membership call. I'll throw that in the chat. That we did on Tuesday that gets into like a little bit of the more weeds. We also NACo will also be hosting future webinars where we go into the weeds of every single of those three eligible use categories. So we're also going to be doing that over the next probably month, I will say. But again, I know that was a lot of information. Appreciate folks bearing through all of that. But Jeff, I'll turn it back over to you. Happy to take any questions if folks have them. I'll also put in, I'm going to put in my email is ehurley@naco.org if folks do have questions as well too. But Jeff, I'll turn it back over to you.
And thank you, Eryn. It certainly was very thorough. And for the folks that were on the call the other day and heard the webinar then, you know, a lot of those uses, especially on the emergency management, responding to natural disaster side as another potential use of ARPA funds. I am checking the chat now to see if anybody has any questions. If you do, we also have the ability to unmute you to just ask your question directly. So if there are any questions, I don't see anybody trying to unmute themselves. Commissioner Starkey, are you on? Did you have any questions for Eryn? I remember. Yes,
Can you
ma'am.
hear me? I'm just wondering if it's still the medical inmate issue is only for suspended states, not terminated states. Thank you.
So the MIP issue is it impacts a lot, like all of the states. So what we're trying to do is that's why we're trying to get those two bills included in the Support Act, so that it would address no matter what, even if you're suspending their benefits, obviously the county is on the hook for paying those as well too. So that's why we're trying to get those two bills inserted.
And again, Eryn, that was for the Support Act. That was both the Reentry Act and the Due Process Continuity Act.
Of care, yes.
Continuity of Care Act. All right, and I'm going to do one more check here, being mindful of everybody's time. Thank you so much for your time here today, for another federal policy update here for FAC and ICG. And I'm sure we're going to have more to talk about next month as the budget process continues to move forward. So thank you again, and I hope everybody has a great day.